I try to keep it as brief as possible, and I jump into that right away. How many of you have heard the sentence of this Ukrainian soldier in the beginning of the war? Oh, I expected a lot more. Still, some of you have heard. We are very lucky that they are so fucking stupid. Well, the truth is that the Russians are learning, and they have learned a lot in the past 2.5 years of this war. Indeed, there is a massive intellectual and institutional capacity for the Russians to learn the lessons from this war and also to distribute all the knowledge they have learned this war. And of course, there is a high incentive for the Russians to gain an objective picture of the operational environment in Ukraine, in spite of the repressive political system in Russia. Russian military thinking is flourishing. The discussion about the lessons of the war is actively encouraged by the Russian military leadership. To quote an example, one of the deputy chiefs of the general staff, Colonel General Trushin, quotes Svechin, who wrote that the lessons of the Russo-Japanese war have not been written by the Russian general staff, so the Russian officers had to rely on French and German sources to learn the lessons from this war. So it's clearly a warning for today's Russian officers that they have to learn the lessons of the current war in Ukraine. After this brief introduction, basically I'm going to talk about two things. The one, the Russian perception of why the war in Ukraine has become a very positional warfare. It largely overlaps with the thoughts you already mentioned in the last 2 days, but I think there are still very important nuances which we have to bear in mind. And the second thing is how they imagine restoring maneuver on this transparent battlefield amidst the current operational environment, and I will close with some concluding remarks. All I say is based on open source Russian sources, mostly articles that have been published in Russian military publications, mostly in the Voyennoye Mis, Military Thought, which is the flagship journal of the Russian General Staff, and also in the Armeyski Zbornik, the Army Review, which is the most popular Russian military publication. These are monthly publications, published every month in a 200-page volume. So this is a massive, as I said, intellectual capacity to learn the lessons of this war. So, how do Russians understand the problem of the positional warfare in Ukraine? The factors they identify can be grouped to two categories, basically. There are contextual reasons based on the choices the Russian leadership made to a larger extent, but also to a smaller extent, the choices the Ukrainian leadership has made during this war. And also, the other category is, of course, the technological reasons why this war ended up in a quote-unquote stalemate. Starting with the first one, but before that, the obligatory quote about the problem of the positional warfare delivered to you, no one else but Alexander Svechin, straight from 1938. Positional forms of war are spoken of with repugnance and fear. They are evolved to be a kind of military plague. War will be or should be one of maneuver, but to say that war will be maneuverable means to say nothing, for this does not depend on our desires. Dogma on the maneuver nature of future war alone can resolve nothing, Svechin holds, in this grandiose problem. Rather, it will sooner lead to a positional war. Svechin also adds to this that positive political goals can be still pursued from the position of a strategic defense. But interestingly, this is not quoted in contemporary Russian military publications, but I will get to that later. So first of all, as many of you have mentioned, it was not evident that this war ended up in a positional war. The Russian plan of the invasion of Ukraine was very maneuver-centric. Russian military thinkers who defined the concept of this quote-unquote special military operation basically grasped the core essence of this, that it being a single combined arms operation to achieve directly a strategic goal in a relatively short period of time. Basically, this is the essence of maneuver warfare. However, and the Russians, as you rightly mentioned, Russian military experts also compare the war or the original plan of the Ukraine invasion to the 1968 intervention in Czechoslovakia, Operation Dunaj or Operation Danube. However, there was clearly a disadvantageous correlation of forces in this invasion. The Russian invasion force counted 180,000 people. This was complemented by the mobilized personnel of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People Republics, or roughly 110,000 people, but that was still inferior to the mobilized Ukrainian armed forces. So the correlation of forces was clearly disadvantageous. And why it was the case? Because there were misconceptions about both the Ukrainian military and also about the Ukrainian society writ large. So the Russian military thinkers now admit that there was an unfounded assumption that the Ukrainian military's morale is very low. There's going to be a mass-scale surrender on behalf of the Ukrainians. Even more, they expected that they're going to change sides, some of them. And they clearly believe that in the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, they're going to be greeted as liberators. And that's not the case. What they faced with instead of bread and flour was public resistance. And it is written by Russian military experts. But also, the Kremlin kept following the strategy of exhaustion in Ukraine because there was no mobilization except for the partial mobilization in the autumn of 2022. So the Kremlin basically pursued a piecemeal approach instead of regenerating, reconstituting force for a larger offensive again. And this was not favored by the Russian military thinkers, as many of them wrote about this. And they would have preferred the continuation of the strategic defense in the summer of 2023 until the Russian military manages to reconstitute itself and generate decisive superiority for a large-scale offensive operation again. But this is not what the logic of the Kremlin was. But the Russian military thinkers are also convinced that Ukraine has lost her chance to re-establish maneuver and achieve a far greater victory in the year of 2022, when throughout most of the year, Ukraine was in a superior position when it comes to the numbers. So the Russians think that instead of focusing for two limited counteroffensive in Kherson and Kharkiv, the Ukrainians could have attempted to break through the Russian defense already down in Zaporizhzhia in the southern part of Ukraine. But for different reasons, the Ukrainians didn't dare to do that. And when they tried to do that, it was already too late. And that transfers us to the issue of the technological causes of the stalemate. On the one hand, yes, as you also mentioned, the transparent battlefield, the drones, the space reconnaissance systems, which basically eliminates the fog of war, the Russians believe. But there are other sources of this positional nature of the war. Let me ask you, what do you think, what weapon system is responsible for most of the tank losses in Ukraine?
Drones?
Yes?
I guess drones.
Drones, yeah?
Mines.
What?
Mines.
Mines, yeah. Yeah, it's a very underappreciated thing, I think, in the Western military thinking. The Russians are convinced that mines are responsible for most of the tank losses of this war. And it's a major problem, and I will elaborate this a little later. Of course, anti-tank weapons. So many of these, except for the drones, are not entirely new. This was just not appreciated enough, not by the West, but also Russian military thinkers either. And as you rightly mentioned in your presentation, the Russians started to embrace positional defense. The Russians very early recognized in this war that the operational environment very heavily favors the defender. This is an article, a cover of one of the articles published in the Armeyski Zbornik. I'll let you digest these graphics there. The title says, Crash of the Citadel 2.0, clear reference to the Russian offensive operation, which ended up in the Kursk battle. You can see German tanks before on the left, German tanks now on the right. the comparison in the Russian military thinking is very obvious. Why? Because they regard the successful defensive operation of 2023 summer as a major turning point in this war. Our guy Sivkov writes that it was not only the defeat of the Ukrainian military, but it was also the defeat of the quote-unquote hybrid blitzkrieg of the West. Very interesting. But also more interesting is that two Russian military thinkers and practitioners, Colonel General Alexander Romanchuk and Alexei Shigin, brought another comparison. It was not a direct comparison, it was between the lines. Their article was published in the Voyennoye Mis in 2023 April. Note the date. It was about enhancing army-level defensive operations. But they didn't bring up the idea of the Kursk defensive operation, but another defensive operation of the Great Patriotic War, Operation Balaton on the territory of Hungary in the spring of 1945. Why they chose this analogy? Well, they chose it because of the very same reasons you just mentioned in your presentation, because the Operation Balaton was a lot more positional defensive operation than the Kursk operation. So during the Operation Balaton, the Soviet military command tried to avoid risky counter-strikes, and instead focused on a very positional defense. What Romanchuk and Shigin highlights in their article is from the Operation Balaton is the courageous maneuvers with the reserves, the use of second echelons, anti-tank reserves, and of course the fire traps, as you also mentioned. Why is it important? Do you know, does the name Alexander Romanchuk sound familiar to you? Nobody? Alexander Romanchuk was in charge of the Zaporizhzhia defensive operation in the summer of 2023. His article has been published a few months before the Ukrainian offensive operation. So they highlighted the importance of positional defense, but in my view, there was also an important comparison when it comes to geography. You see the defensive operation Balaton from 1945, the German army launched the offensive in the south between the river Drava and Balaton here, and also between the river Balaton and the lake Balaton and the lake Velence there. And of course, the plan of the Ukrainian counteroffensive was no secret for the Russians. They knew more or less where the major operation will take place on behalf of the Ukrainians. But they also expected an amphibious operation probably here in Kherson until the Russians blew up the Kakhovka Dam. So in geographic sense, there was the major water barrier in this case too, represented by the river Dnipro. In spite, however, that the Russians favor and fully embrace positional defense, or would have favored that had the Kremlin not had other motives or goals, it doesn't mean that the Russians are not thinking about restoring maneuver, if not in Ukraine, then in a future war. This article by Shilovsky, he wrote this in 1944, has been republished in the Voyennoye Mis May edition of this year. The title says, "On some fundamentals of operational breakthrough." Clearly, the editors of the Voyennoye Mis wanted to provide a food for thought to discuss for the Russian officers and Russian military thinkers. Among other things, I think what is important in this article by Shilovsky is that he discusses or contemplates the necessary depth and width and tempo of an operational breakthrough, which is clearly now an issue for Russian and also Western military thinkers, that amidst the current circumstances, operational environment, what is the required depth and width of an operational breakthrough. So, what points or prerequisites the Russians raise as necessary preconditions to restore maneuver in the current operational environment? So first of all, a superiority in command has to be achieved. They don't discuss mission command at all. They don't bring up even the terminology, the term of mission command. What they talk about is the optimal ratio of decentralized and centralized command and the smooth transition from one to the other if needs arises. What they instead discuss more about is automated command and control systems, and they acknowledge that they are clearly lagging behind of the potential enemy, meaning NATO, but also thanks to the NATO support to Ukraine, also they are lagging behind Ukraine in this war. And they draw a straight parallel again with the Great Patriotic War, when the German Wehrmacht was equipped with radios, when the Russians have been lacking radio communication equipment, and despite they had a numerical superiority, the Germans managed to bring heavy defeat in the early period of the war. Also, they think that before any operation and before each phase of the operation, a radio, electronic, and fire battle should be performed. Radioelektronná огневая сражение in Russian. And it should be carried out by a separate planning group in the staff of the given unit, because the electronic warfare troops are not satisfactory to carry out this mission on their own. This also requires a very deep knowledge about the enemy combat system. So one Russian military theorist argues that due to the resiliency of the network-centric command, a 4-minute difference between the coordination of electronic and fire strike can decrease the effectiveness of the disorganization impact by 30 to 40%. So a major problem for the Russians is the synchronization. Deception is still possible in a transparent battlefield. That's what other Russian military thinkers argue. They name this many forms of deception in the operational environment in Ukraine, and some of deceptive tactics are still working. It's not about the technology, the Russians say, it's about the poor implementation thereof in Ukraine. Also reflexive control, reflexivное управление, the essence of which is that to force the enemy to behave in a certain way which is expected by us, which is favorable for us, but he is convinced that it actually favors him, not the enemy. Again, this requires that on any command level, the commander has to know not only the own combat capability, the system working, the characteristics of the combat system, but of the enemy as well. And they are adapting in Ukraine. This excerpt from the Ukrainskaya Pravda article, the Russians exploit when there is a troop rotation on the side of the Ukrainians, because in the troops rotations, they withdraw their electronic warfare equipment as well, which allows the Russians to operate their drones and take advantage of this. As I mentioned, mines are the biggest issue. The Russian military thinkers claim that the technology of mine clearing has stuck in the 1990s, whereas the mining technology has improved very much. And the war in Ukraine illustrated that the explosive ways of mine removal and the mechanical ways of mine removal is not working, and only they can rely on removing mines by hand. So they see the unmanned aerial and ground systems as the solution in a future war to tackle the issue of mines. Fire support. Moving fire zone, which is not a new concept in the Russian military thinking. It was a response to the appearance of ATGM weapons in the 70s. It was worked out to suppress these type of weapons, but the Russians think that this could work against attack drones too. This is the schematic figure of an artillery support for a motor rifle regiment with the method of moving or rolling fire zone. And jumping to the conclusions, first of all, what the Russian military thinkers highlight, guys like former chief of the general staff, Yuri Baluyevsky, is that out of snobbery and hubris, the Russians underestimated the lessons of the Iran-Iraq War. Instead, they focused on the 1991 Gulf War, and they now also acknowledge that the strategy of annihilation can work very rarely and only against a technologically inferior opponent. This is a clear departure from earlier thought, as the Russians believed, literally months before the war, that the form of war between technologically and economically developed nations will take the form of a strategy of annihilation and not the strategy of exhaustion. Now there is a clear departure, very likely due to the experience of the war in Ukraine. And what I want to highlight your attention to is that there is a huge discrepancy between the practice of the Russian way of war and the Russian military theory. So the Russians have managed to overcome this very challenge of positional warfare in the past after the First World War, as you rightly mentioned, Tukhachevsky's Fechenisters. There is no reason to believe that they will not be capable of coming up with a solution again. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.